we are more divided today, combining insights from a real cross-section of academic and other work, from history, psychology, sociology, even evolutionary biology, as well as John's own personal experience, wide-ranging personal experience. It's a powerful explanation of where the people like me syndrome that John discusses comes from, why it matters, but also how that particular part of human nature, which we can't get away from, doesn't need to end in further division. And the book is an equally rich mix of suggestions of how we can support a greater sense of connection through a carefully considered model of choices that we face to support what John calls our common life. It also includes 32 actions we can all do. Most books that I've read, including my own, struggle to come up with 5 or 10 actions, even on things we can do. But John has 32, so it's well worth looking through for that alone. John is director of the Youth Endowment Fund and has held many other roles that give him a great perspective on this as an issue, from a community worker in Newham to establishing youth charities and advising ministers. And John will kick us off with a 15-minute run-through of the book and its main themes. Then we'll have 7 to 8 minutes of reflections from each of our 2 brilliant panelists who are with us now. Firstly, we'll have Burble Singh, who is founder and headmistress of the incredible Michaela Community School. Has written and edited a number of books herself, including the latest one called The Power of Culture, which outlines the Michaela approach to teaching and the much broader development of children. Then we'll have Raphael, who's columnist and leader writer at The Guardian, with previous editorial roles at The Observer and New Statesman and many other media roles, and who hosts the excellent Politics on the Couch podcast. Then we'll have some discussion response from John, and of course, questions from you. We've got a lovely tight 1-hour session here on the book, great at this time of endless Zoom meetings. Keep it tight to an hour, so I'll do my best to get through as many questions, but as always in these sessions, early questions have a much better chance of getting through to being asked, so do start thinking about questions as we go through. So we'll get straight in, and over to you, John.
Bobby, thanks so much for that very warm introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all, and an honour to be hosted by King's College. I even put on a jacket to really make a proper effort. The core argument of the book is that the average Brit and the majority of Americans are right about something. So half of British people tell posters that their country has never felt so divided. 80% of Americans say that their country is mainly or entirely divided. And I think they're onto something. And I think we can tell they're right by looking at our friendship groups. So half of us who have degrees don't have a single friend who doesn't have a degree. The majority of pensioners don't have anyone they have contact with under the age of 35, unless it's their grandchildren. A fifth of those of us who voted to leave don't have a friend who voted to remain. A quarter of us who voted to remain don't have a friend who voted to leave. Half of us don't have any friends from a different ethnic background, and yet the biggest divide of all remains by wealth or class. So a UK barrister would have to invite 100 people into their garden, 3 times the legal limit, before they would invite a single person who is unemployed. And I also think we've misdiagnosed the cause of this problem. And again, the average person, I think, has a better sense of what's going on than many of us who are writing books and writing columns. Many of my conversations about division tend to end up with somebody saying, "Oh, but John, come on. It's always been like this. Birds of a feather flock together." And actually, they're onto something. There's a man called Francis Evans who in the 1950s travelled up and down America, and he followed people knocking door to door selling life insurance. And what he found was they were more likely to make a sale if the person who answers the door voted the same way as them. They were more likely to make a sale if the buyer was the same height as them. They were more likely to make a sale if the buyer earned the same amount of money as them. We have a small, constant bias to people who remind us of ourselves. 39,000 different academic studies have come to the same conclusion, and they've taken place from Kuala Lumpur to Kingston. And this tendency, which academics call homophily, and I prefer to call people like me syndrome, affects where we live, who we make friends with, who we work with, and even who we write academic papers with. But people like me syndrome is a very partial explanation of why we're dividing now. In the same way that if you said to me, why was it sunny last week, but it's not sunny now? And I said to you, well, the sun, you would find that a very dissatisfying answer, because the sun is constantly pretty hot. Something has to be changing to make the change occur. So what is it? To understand that, a trip to northern Tanzania would help us. On the coast of Lake Eyasi is a tribe called the Hadza, who have lived there for 60,000 years. There are 400 members of that tribe, and they're a very unusual tribe in that in the modern era, they are hunter-gatherers. The other thing that's really unusual about the Hadza is what they do once a month. So once a month, when the moon is gone and the sky is completely black, the Hadza gather together with other Hadza who they've bedded down in the same area as, to perform something called the Apem. Now, the Apem is basically a dance. The men go off and they hide, normally behind a set of trees, and one by one they will come out wearing a headdress made of black ostrich feathers, holding a rattle with bells around one ankle and with a black cape, and they will lead off the dancing. And as they lead, women then join the dance, and then children also take part. And the Apem will last quite a while, with each man leading off 2 or 3 times. Now, the odd thing about the Apem is it serves no obvious purpose at all for the Hadza. It doesn't resolve disputes. It doesn't decide who's in charge. It doesn't play a role in their economy. It doesn't fit into some sort of organized religious explanation of the world that they have. And so a group of anthropologists decided to follow the Hadza around to try and work out what was going on. And they particularly focused on, who do the Hadza tend to trust? Who do Hadza lend tools to? Who do they bed down with for the night? Who do they gossip with? And they found there were 2 things that drove who the Hadza trust. The first is who are they really closely related to. 400 Hadza, but they form into little smaller families. And their first basis of trust is their close kin. But the second was who they danced the Apem with. And what the anthropologists found was actually the Hadza were more likely to trust somebody who they danced the Apem with than someone who they were closely related to. To use our modern language, what the Apem is doing for the Hadza is making their diversity of family group, work. Now, what's interesting about the Apem is it brings together people with people that you don't choose to spend time with. You don't get to pick who you dance with. And in that way, it overcomes people like me syndrome, because we're not picking who to spend our time with. And it bonds people together through an intense shared experience. Now, this sort of institution where we don't choose and we bond, you can actually find throughout human society, throughout human history. When we were hunter-gatherers, many of us had these sort of animalistic rituals. When we became farmers, those rituals died away, but a new set of institutions were thrown up. They included feast days, rites of passage, or religious ceremonies. Now, these were a big deal. The average 14th century English person spent 1 in 5 days in a feast day. Why on earth were they doing this? Because again, they connected people together. And then when we moved to be city dwellers after the Industrial Revolution, those feast days died away, but a new set of institutions were born. I'm talking about the clubs and societies that grew like crazy from about 1750 to about 1912. Nearly all the societies that we can think of and name today come from that period, from the Guides to the Scouts, the Women's Institute, etc., etc. And they bonded us together, but they weren't the only things that did this. We also see the birth of the school. Before 1880, schooling was not mandatory in England. And yet after that, all children had to go to school, and they went to school with people they didn't choose to be educated with. And then we think about the workplace. There was really no workplace for most villagers. There was no workplace for nomads. But in the cities, people went to work. And in doing so, they mixed with people they didn't choose to spend their time with. And so you end up with a new common life. And I use that word common life because there is no term to describe these institutions, from the Apem to the clubs and societies. And so we should call it a common life, an institution that gives us something in common. So why has our society become more divided? Well, the reason is because we have been losing the common life that connected together our grandparents and our great-grandparents. Human history is really a struggle between people like me syndrome on the one hand and the common life on the other hand. And all of those institutions that connect our grandparents and great-grandparents together have been going into some form of decline. So clubs and societies. Every single generation since 1950 is less likely than the previous one to join a club and society. But hang on, we still go to school, we still go to work. Surely I'm not suggesting those things have gone into decline. No, they haven't. But we increasingly choose where we send our children to school, and we increasingly choose where we go to work. And so therefore that space where we don't choose who we spend our time with declines. Now, the question therefore is why? Why has the common life declined? That's the question we should have been wrestling with. And the good news is, I think I've identified the two villains of the piece. The bad news is they're two things we really like. The first villain of the piece, which I've hinted at already, is the villain that's made our schools and our workplaces more full of people like me syndrome. It's choice. I really like choice. I like choosing what I do. I like choosing where I work. I like being able to choose where I send my children to school. I think choice drives high standards in schooling. So I'm in favour of choice. But once choice comes in, people like me syndrome has an opportunity. But what about the clubs and societies? What about the APEM? What about the feast days? They weren't followed. They weren't mandatory. There was pressure, but people chose whether to get involved. So it's not choice that's killed them off. What has killed them off? Well, the truth is, the only reason they were so able to get everybody involved voluntarily is they just brilliantly fitted the moment. The APEM really fits the way the Hadsers live. They are camping out at night without very much to do. But it doesn't fit in an agrarian society. And when things change, it dies away. Feast days fit the way agrarians live with their moments of farming. It doesn't really fit in an industrial society, and so it died away. The trouble is they don't adapt. Voluntary institutions change very slowly. They don't scale fast. They don't randomly mutate, and they don't adapt to change. Instead, they wither. And therefore, that's why we've seen our clubs and societies decline. Rapid change of our economy, rapid change in our values, rapid change in movement of people, rapid change in alternative entertainment. The television is a key part of this story, much more than social media. And the trouble is, without a common life to connect us, we become more divided and bad stuff starts to happen. I won't go into this now, but the book touches on the impact on our democracy, the impact on social mobility, the impact on our economy, the impact on our security from terrorism, and the impact on levels of anxiety. The question we should finish on, though, is what do we do about it? And we have three options, three big options. The first one is to do absolutely nothing about it, to just wait it out, wait for a new common life to evolve that fits our new society. Maybe something from the internet will pop up that connects us together in a marvelous way, in the same way clubs and societies did after the Industrial Revolution. It's a perfectly valid option. It's the option that basically every Western society, bar a few, is taking right now. I don't think consciously, but it's the approach we're taking. We just should know that we could be waiting quite a long time. It took 1,000 years for the agrarian common life to spring up. It took 100 years for the industrial common life to arrive. And so let's wait it out, but let's stop whining about our divisions while we do. The second option then is to take on one of the villains, is to slow down the rate of change. This is the route that the Nordic countries have arguably taken. I don't think they've done it consciously. But those three Scandinavian countries and Finland have slowed down the impact of economic change on their societies through generous welfare payments. They've had much less movement of people in their countries. Their values haven't changed so much, and they don't watch so much television. The result is that their clubs and societies have held up their membership, and there's been space for them to adapt to meet people's changing needs. The result is those four countries, when you rank all the countries in the world that are rich for trust, responsibility, and understanding, they come first, second, third, and fifth. I just don't think slowing down the rate of change is a credible, trustworthy option for us today. I think the amount of change we might see over the next half century could be highly significant as we see changes in our technology. So, what's the final option? Well, the final option is to look at the country that came fourth in that list. That's the small island of Singapore. Now, Singapore's approach has been to be incredibly open to change. 40% of Singaporeans were born overseas, incredibly open to economic change, quite a significant change in people's values. But they've restricted certain levels of choice. And what I mean by that is they created moments when people have to connect in their life with people who they didn't choose to spend time with. They've done it in the way they think about their schooling. They've done it in the way that they approach national service. They've done it even in the way they allocate housing. Now, I'm not really saying, am I, that we could lift what's going on in Singapore and copy and paste it over here? No, I'm not. I don't think we can do a precise copy and paste. But I think we haven't even considered what a vague copy and paste would look like. What would a Western version of a mandatory common life be like? We assume it must be so horrific, we don't even open the door and have a look. I think it might look like this. It might say every child has to spend 100 months by law already in education. What if they spent one of those months doing some community activity with children from completely different schools, including private schools? It might say that many of us, not all of us, but many of us will start a family at some point. Well, I think the government should make a more generous offer around childcare, but maybe in return, it should ask parents to come along to a series of sessions where they learn about how their child brains works and what they can do to support their children's development. But maybe they do it with parents from across town, people they didn't choose to spend time with. And thirdly, most of us are going to retire at some point. We're probably a third of our life still to live. We've got lots more to contribute. So how about a program that says, yes, we'll continue to be generous to pensions, but in return, you should find ways to get involved in your local community. 3 new institutions to knit us together. Now, the response that you all might give as I close would be, fine, but this sounds completely inconceivable. And so I would finish with 2 points. The first is, maybe it does, but what's the alternative? At present, our alternative seems to be some warm words, some kind thoughts about British values and some street parties for the Queen's birthday every now and again. We are bringing warm words to a gunfight. And finally, when we think about all the major things that have happened over the last century that have been important in our country's history, from the creation of the welfare state to the creation of the NHS, from the going into the EU to the leaving of the EU, haven't all of those things at first seemed completely inconceivable until they suddenly became imaginable, until they became plausible, until they became likely, until they became unavoidable? In writing this book, Fractured, I want to start the journey for the idea of a mandatory common life from being inconceivable, from being unavoidable. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was excellent, John. Perfectly on time. Always in absolute awe of people summarizing their whole book in such perfect, capturing the essence of it really, really clearly in just 15 minutes. That was great. Thank you so much, John. We're going to move straight on to Catherine next. We are getting questions through. Well done, including comments as well on our inability to appreciate dance in England, English people's inability to appreciate the power of dance, which is a useful sideline for us. But Catherine, straight over to you for your reflections.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Well, I want to say, well, I don't want to embarrass him, and I tell you, he doesn't know I'm about to say this, but I think John is just brilliant. And I tell you why I think he's brilliant. It's because he embodies all of the kind of attitudes that he's talking about or wanting to work against in his book. When he first wrote to me and asked me to be part of this, you know, lots of people ask me to do lots of things, and I obviously run a school and I'm really busy, and 99.9% of the things that I'm asked to do, I say no to. I certainly don't say yes to, you know, the kids are all outside. There's a million things at lunchtime now, you know, thank goodness I was on mute because the pips were going off a moment ago, and there's 1,000 things going on. And I never say yes to something in the middle of the day like this. Why did I say yes to John? Well, it's because he embodies everything that he believes in. It's because when he wrote to me, he put himself in my shoes, and what he said spoke to me. And he thought about, well, I know you're really busy, and I know this, and I imagine this, but I wonder whether if, and I wonder whether this, and he was so polite, and he did it in such a charming way. And then I asked a question, and then he responded. His emails weren't too long, but they weren't so short that I didn't get enough information. He just handled it all perfectly. And so I felt I couldn't say no. And here I am. And I think what I want to say is that all of these, like John spoke a lot about what the government should do and how we should run society and so on. But it occurs to me that because he has all of these qualities and doesn't really think about it, that what he hasn't said is how important it is for us as individuals, the kinds of people that we want to be, We should want to be people who understand other people. We should want to put ourselves in other people's shoes. That every time we think anything, we should always think, well, why does the other person think differently? And that whenever you get into a discussion with anyone where they think differently to you, you're trying to understand what they've said. Often when you get into a discussion with somebody or an argument, you come out with your side. And sometimes you're speaking at cross purposes because you haven't actually understood what the other person is saying. And so, being a headmistress, I listen to John and I think, oh, I want our children to be just like him. I was thinking this when he wrote to me. I thought, I want all our kids to be just like John Yates, is what I was thinking. And because when you're a teacher, you're constantly trying to, you want the children to grow up with a sense of empathy. And you want them to consider all options, not just because you're trying to make it so that your society isn't fractured, but because you also want them to be the kinds of people who do well in life. John did well. He's got me on this panel. He got what he wanted, right? And he got what he wanted because he has various skills, which he's trying to now bring out across society and saying, well, look, let's get this happening all over the place so that en masse, we aren't shutting down and preventing conversation between people. And as a teacher, as I say, we think constantly about character development. How are we developing the character of our children to be people who are open-minded, who are wanting to hear from other people who don't think like them, who are constantly questioning and are constantly thinking, and who aren't just stuck in their ways and sticking to that. And it was really interesting listening to him talking about mixing people, because, for instance, at lunchtime, we do what's called a family lunch. And all the children, and the reduction of choice. So that is huge for us here at Michaela. We reduce their options massively. And number one thing I say to parents as advice and to schools and deputy heads and so on is reduce their choice. And I think the last 50, 60 years, we seem to think that somehow it's cruel to give children fewer choices. And once upon a time, it was perfectly normal to always restrict, what would you like to eat tonight, darling? Well, why on earth are you asking them? Just give them their meal, Would you like to have a bath tonight? No, you decide, you're the mom, right? So, and similarly at lunch, for instance, in most canteens, the child goes along with their tray and they pick what they want from the various variety of things, and they sit down and they eat their meal with whoever they want to sit with. And various children are left out and are essentially being bullied because, well, you're not the cool kids. And some kids have food thrown at them. And it's quite a hostile place. The dining room can be a hostile place in most schools. Whereas I would say, lots of schools who have gone along the route that we've done, which is a family lunch, they cannot choose where they're going to sit. They have to sit in a particular place. And there are 6 or 7 children around the table. And each one of them has a role. One of them has the role to go and get the food. The other role has the role of, giving it out. Another one has the role of pouring the water and so on. And we call it family because it creates a family atmosphere where they're all eating the same thing. So no one can choose their lunch. Everyone at Michaela eats the same lunch every single day, including the teachers. Everyone eats the same thing. And so when that happens, you remove that choice, but it forces all the children to appreciate the food they've got and to appreciate the children on their table. And then we deliberately mix up the classes so that different classes are on different tables. And one of the things that COVID has done to us, which is terrible, is that it's made it so that we have had to bubble the kids so they're always on the same tables with the classes that they move around with. And that tends to be the top set, stick with the top set, bottom set, or with the bottom set, you see. And just what John was saying about different sections of society who never meet. The barrister has to invite 100 people in before he gets someone who's homeless. Similarly, the top set would never talk to the bottom set in a normal school. Whereas here, because they're not given the choice and they're forced to sit on these mixed tables normally when COVID isn't happening, then they have the opportunity to talk to somebody who's from a different space than they would otherwise be, and to kind of make that connection. So, yeah, I just thought in so many ways, that's just an example of how John is talking about the big picture outside in terms of the country. In a small way in school, I see that repeated many, many times. And I know how important it is for choice to be removed in a big way from children. And parents just don't realize it's because we reject the notion of authority, that parents should be in a position of authority where they are in charge. It's not the children who are in charge, and we shouldn't be scared of that. That's what children expect of us. And that part of that responsibility is removing some of their choices so that we can help mold them. And that when we mold them, all the stuff when you were saying was really weird, John, you were saying, oh, this might sound a bit weird. When it comes to children, restricting things for them helping them to grow up into a certain type of human being, well, that's our role as adults. And too often, I think we've lost that role.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Catherine. That was great to pick up on those themes. We're going to go straight over to Raphael. And as I say, great questions coming in, really, really useful ones. Thank you. Do keep them coming, and we'll come back to them. Raph.
Hi, thank you. Catherine might not have been able to see there, but I was applauding very vigorously as a parent to the idea that you shouldn't give your children too many choices in terms of what they're going to eat at any one stage. So thank you for that. And also I applaud whoever in the Q&A is talking about dancing. There should definitely be more dancing. I'll try and be really brief, because I just want to make, I think, 3 observations on what John has said, and some mixed in with some thoughts I had while reading the book. I think, as an introductory point, I do think it's tremendously important that he sets up at the beginning this tension between what feels very new and what has ever been thus. You know, what is basically an expression of human nature and what is a function of social change that seems to be happening. And I think, certainly as someone who writes about politics, I'm very vulnerable to what we call the sort of recency bias, that I always want to think about what is happening in the news and how this is somehow new. I have to make it seem new, because if I wrote every week in my column, well, people were just people again this week, it would be a very short column, and I would put myself out of a job. And in the beginning of John's book, early on, he talks about, as he mentioned just earlier, industrialization and the social dislocations and displacements that happened out of that, and how society responded. And, you know, supporting this thesis that it was ever thus, but we are also going through something very different, or very substantial, I should say, rather, now. And obviously with Brexit just in the background so recently, there is this tendency, I think, to think that that was sort of year 0 in political culture, and we're just counting from then. The one sort of caveat I would add to that, and I'd be interested in John's thoughts on this, are that going back a little bit before Brexit to the sort of the beginning of the 21st century and the extraordinary change in the digital space that has happened, that to me does feel like one of the rare epoch-defining moments that we've had, in the same order of magnitude as the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it really is that big. And I was struck, you know, and you can't write about everything, obviously, and I think, you know, again, people have say the same things about social media now that they once said about television, that they once said about novels in the 19th century, you know, so these things, again, they're not new. One way in which I think the social media is different is to connect with what your point about choice, or this idea that when people have the capacity to select, the sort of disaggregation gets supercharged, and what we know is that in terms of who you follow on Twitter or who you friend on Facebook, the capacity, or the fact that the way in which we have now this vast machine that works very much with the grain of our cognitive biases, and the, you know, all the sorts of selection biases and the sort of heuristics, as we to use the word, that enable us to reinforce our own beliefs, and caricature the beliefs that we don't want to believe, and select in an extremely fast way. That does to me feel qualitatively different even from television when I was growing up, where you only had 3 channels, and if you wanted to watch TV on a Sunday, you were stuck with Pebble Mill and the Antiques Roadshow, and if you were lucky, Ski Sunday, because it had cool music. But you know, that's not Facebook, and it's not Twitter. So that, I think, is quite important. The second point I would want to pick up is, you mentioned the Scandinavian experience is, I think, fantastically important. And I think a lot of people, you know, I write for The Guardian, I broadly come from the sort of social democratic liberal left tradition in this country. And for a long time, Scandinavia was always held up as the sort of the bastion of social democratic politics, when liberal free market capitalism was sort of capturing British politics. And then that became slightly more awkward when the social democracies of Scandinavia and the Nordic countries became more explicitly hostile to mass migration, and started to express this view quite clearly that if you want a sort of welfare state, if you want to nurture the idea that everyone in a nation state pitches in and helps each other, it is problematic when you have very dramatic sudden changes culturally and increase in diversity. And you do mention that in the book, and you talked about labour migration, but it's a fantastically, I know, because I write for The Guardian and deal with politics all the time, I know it's a very, very hard thing to articulate. I mean, I remember when David Goodhart really first made this point in an essay in Prospect magazine, probably about 15 years ago. he was, I mean, this is maybe a bit of a caricature, but he was kind of expelled from the liberal left for saying that social democracy gets a bit undermined by multiculturalism. And it's something that's very, very difficult to articulate in a political sphere for a number of reasons. I mean, the simplest one is basically you have this sort of structural problem where sort of obviously, I think obviously, not everyone who complains about the scale or the speed of migration is a racist. But every racist complains about the scale and the speed of migration. So by articulating that concern and talking about the legitimate concerns of people in communities that they feel have changed too quickly or too dramatically, you are necessarily rhyming with things that are articulated by actual racists and have been articulated by people from, you know, going back to Enoch Powell and beyond and further to the right. And so what happens is you get this allergy on the sort of centre left against just going there because it's so difficult. And what when you talk about a common, when a book, I'm sort of addressing this to you, I don't mean this in the second person, I mean more generally in the theme, when one talks about the common life, I think an important part of that is the difficulty we have in having a common vocabulary and a lexicon, because what tends to happen, again, particularly I think on the political left, but also on the right, people find their own terms that they feel comfortable with, and then they start speaking across each other and not communicating, and it becomes, before you can even get a common life, you find that no one's actually even speaking the same language about key issues. And you see this very much in the sort of Leaver-Remainer divide, that they both say the word Brexit, but they mean it completely differently. You know, when Remainers say Brexit, the whole apparatus of what they're thinking about in their heads, it's a cost, it's a negative, it's about the institutions of the European Union, it's about Britain's standing in the world, and for Leavers it could be all sorts of other things, and about sovereignty and national expression and democracy because you voted for it and the Remainers didn't want to give it to you. So those are really totally different things, and it's a mistake to use the same word for them. And then the third observation that I'd make in relation to this, I love the idea of sort of a state mandated common life in a way, and I remember looking at the citizenship, I can't remember what it was called, the program that David Cameron introduced. It was sort of national service, a sort of cuddly national service for volunteering, and it didn't really get enough support. It was part of the big society, but the Conservatives at the time weren't particularly behind proper state involvement in that. They wanted it to be very voluntary, and also they were doing fiscal austerity, and so there wasn't money around for it. We can argue about that forever. But what's interesting is that you never really got to the level of saying what we're really talking about is national service, but for cultural and social engagement. And what that raises in my mind is the question, and it's not just about fiscal transfers, although fiscal transfers are inevitably important in that. It's this question of if the state is getting involved in sort of reweaving a social fabric. You know, if you think the bones are broken and you've got to sort of pin it in place for the molecules to knit enough that it's fixed, you're talking about a kind of a state project to foster and nurture solidarity. And then the question is, what is the most practical, realistic social unit of solidarity? So if I have a whip round in my street, it's really easy. I know my neighbours, and like I say, we live on the same street, hello. If it's a school gate thing, okay, the kids are all at the same school, that's relatively easy. In a village, easiest, you know, possible. Small town, okay, yeah, it's still possible. You could maybe have, you know, I'd localise taxes on this basis. Once you get bigger, you know, inter-region gets problematic. At the level of the nation state, historically, that was a pretty reliable source, but that's become problematic. We've established that the European Union, that's getting a bit big now, isn't it? Because, you know, the Germans don't necessarily want to pay for a Greek deficit, or there are all sorts of other cases of that. Even in the Union of the United Kingdom, you get some tensions in terms of whether the English do or don't subsidise the Scots and who's paying for it and all that sort of stuff. So that's really the point I'd finish on now. I just think this, because I come at everything slightly through a political lens, I'm fascinated by this question of what realistically is the political unit on which you can cultivate successfully solidarity in a multicultural society. And I now have to take a breath. Thank you. Great book, by the way.
Brilliant ending. And, you know, great comments. Thank you for that, Raphael. I think we've had some excellent questions come in. Thank you for those. And I've tried to group them into some themes, which I'll come back to in a second. But first of all, John, any reflections on Catherine and Raphael's point?
Yeah, I mean, phenomenally helpful comments. I mean, I just on Catherine's point about the canteen. I mean, there's a story that I tell in the book about two schools, Count Hill and Breeze Hill in Oldham, one of which was pretty much entirely white British, and one of which was almost entirely Asian British. And the two schools were merged to form a new school, Waterhead Academy. And sociologists tracked who the children chose to sit next to in the lunch hall. And what they found, the first thing they found was that the Asian British children and the white British children didn't choose to mix very much. It's not actually that surprising because they've been educated in different schools. But what interested me is they tracked hair colour. And they found that kids were more likely to sit next to kids who had the same hair color. So ginger-haired kids sat next to ginger-haired kids, and kids with glasses were more likely to sit next to kids with glasses. So you can easily find. I mean, the canteen's a really interesting place where you do see people like, there we go, me and Raphael would be mates. You do see find these places where people like me syndrome just plays in, and a restriction of choice, although it sounds really odd and countercultural, can give people friendships and connections that they value hugely. I mean, Raph made so many great challenges and thoughts. I mean, just to touch on them briefly, social media is important. I mean, the thing I'd say is I think this I find that these concepts that I've termed, they're not new to me, but I've termed people like me syndrome and the common life, quite helpful to think about things like social media. You know, why is social media dividing us? Well, it really empowers people like me syndrome. What's the cost of changing who you follow? Almost zero. And so we shouldn't be surprised that people like me syndrome plays a huge role. Where's the space that people connect people they don't choose to meet with? Pretty much nowhere. And so therefore we shouldn't be surprised it's quite a divided space. I think my critique of it as an explanation is it's being overplayed because of recency bias. So everyone's going, why are we divided? Look, chalk image on the floor of the dead, lack of connection. Oh, hang on, social media has just arrived. Aha. And I think that's oversimple. And I think TV is it's a better explanation. And the reason I say it is the common life was a lot of these voluntary community activities. There's an interesting town in Canada called Notel, which kept up its clubs and associations when all the rest of the West was losing them. And the reason was that it's not really called Notel, it's code. It's a town that didn't have television. And then in the fall of 1973, they put TV in, and the clubs and societies fell away. So I think we do need to look at other causes more. Raf's point on immigration is such an important one. I mean, why does immigration sort of charge us so much as an issue? It's because we're talking about people we love and people we care about and ourselves. And, therefore, we're talking about whether we should be welcomed and welcoming. And we're talking about change in our societies. I mean, I remember when Plymouth, where I'm from, suddenly expanded the universities and 1,000 new students turned up. And people in Plymouth, even though it was great for the economy, hated it. We struggle with newness and change without necessarily being anti people in their early 20s. So it's a sensitive topic. I mean, what I say in the book is I think trying to say that you can solve divisions through immigration policy for a country like the UK is madness. We are a diverse place by ethnicity, and even if you said let's have no more immigration ever again, we're going to become more diverse ethnically. So it's a silly thing to over focus on. So I think there's a good debate to be had, but I don't think we need to have it here. The debate we should be having is how do we make connection happen? And actually, friends who feel very deeply about immigration would agree with me that the difference by income is a real problem, and we need to bridge those divides. And so I think there's so much common ground about actually how do we make connection happen. I think that it's really important, though, that the spaces that we make for people to connect are not places that one group owns. And as sort of the majority group says, it's got to be on this basis. And I think a key part of that is those of us who read books like this and think about this stuff, we tend to like talking, and we tend to like talking about politics and ideas. Most people aren't interested in that. And the trouble is we therefore think that these common spaces must be very worthy places where we debate and discuss, identity and issues. No, they don't need to be. People don't want to come to that. Let's play sport. Let's do activities together. Let's find passions. Let's create. Let's read literature. Let's do things that people enjoy doing. And I think that plays a bit into the question of what's the unit. So when people move from villages to cities, in the Industrial Revolution, we understate the amount of diversity that happened at that moment because we look for ethnic diversity. What we should be looking for is people have lived in those villages for generations, right? They've always been there. That's their world. And suddenly they're thrown into this world where there's all these people from lots of different villages. And it's hugely disconnecting and alienating and horrible and very divisive. How do people connect? It wasn't through a sense of, I am Mancunian, I love Manchester, hooray for Manchester. It was because they started joining little clubs where they met people from other villages, and they began to realize these people who they thought were different were actually had some things in common with them. So I think we overplay the role of the unit and the national story or the city story, and we underplay just the random links and the random connections.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. So we got I'm trying to just get through as many of these questions as I can, because they do break down into themes, and probably the big one is a really interesting discussion around choice and mandation and the interaction between those two things. But I just want to pick off one on technology, because it is a couple of questions on technology. So I think that's really relevant, just picking up on what you were saying there, John. So I think we agree about looking to technology as a sole source of some of these divisions, or even the main one, is a bit of a red herring. But I mean, it is a reality that we live in a very different sort of age. So the questions, two kind of interlinked, I think, questions. So we're now in the information age. We have choice to associate entirely on a non-geographical basis. So looking at this more positively rather than as a cause of division, what do you think about the common virtual spaces? How do we create, and what's the right level to recreate that type of common physical space in the digital environment? Does that work? Is that a thing that we can throw into this? And then really good question on, is common life as profitable as fractured life? And I think that could be a good strapline for some elements of the book. The economic factors here. So that the person asking this question is that they're thinking of social media platforms, newspaper, cable, Netflix, rely on capturing fragments of markets, and in some cases pushing that polarization. Two interlinked points.
Yeah, they are really linked because they both really come down to design thinking, I think. So, we tend to think of integration as something that's a question of government policy. And obviously the book is pushing to say, I think the government should act. But actually, it's also a question of design. So what I mean by that is, how did we solve this problem previously? We waited it out, which I recommend we don't do now, but we waited it out. And eventually someone designed something that was so fitting with the moment that everyone wanted to be part of it. And it was designed in a way that it could be adapted. So many different clubs and societies, different type of rituals, different types of feast days, different roles people could play, that people were excited to get in. So you've got very, very high take up. Now, what we need is many more people to take the digital space to say, okay, how am I going to design an interaction here that will work for common life? So what would be the principles you're looking for? And what the book summarizes is, hopefully a super accessible way, is this huge body of research that says, actually, it's kind of, we know what is needed. One, people shouldn't choose the people that they're going to spend time with because the bias kicks in too hard. The second is people who are different have got to want to be part of it. So you've got to design something not for a niche, which is generally easier. That's why I do think it is generally more profitable, but that can meet a number of niches. Thirdly, it's got to either have a moment of intensity about it or some routine. And we are just weird as humans, and we don't totally understand why we work. But intense moments create really firm memories. And the people who are with us in those the technical term is an episodic memory, like an episode of our life. People who are with us in those moments, we tend to think have the same identity as us. And so it shapes who we share and who we see as like us. So you'd want to design something that followed those principles. There's an example in the book that's counter to this, that where someone's running a new sort of housing estate, and they just design the estate. It's a retirement home, and they design it really consciously. This is where the Trump voters will go. This is where the Liberals will go. This is where, because it's just easier. And so we do need people who care about this to think about design better. Oh, Bobby, you're on mute, I think.
Let me unmute myself. I've got drilling in the background. That's why I'm trying to keep that away from you. Raphael and Catherine, any reflections on that kind of digital question, positive potential? Yeah. Oh, Catherine, I think I saw your hand first, and then Raphael.
Okay, don't worry. Well, I sort of think that, John, you're not giving enough weight to the whole social media thing. You know, I mean, I'm saving your book to till the summer, because when the summer holidays come, I have time to read. And I'm really looking forward to it. And it all sounds brilliant, and everything you've said today sounds great. And when you write your second book, you're going to write about social mobility and social, the world of social media. That, like, when you say people need to want to go, yeah, and they won't go if if they can be on WhatsApp and Instagram. My kids, I mean, just to give you a sense, and this is me sort of thinking, this is the divide. Like, you don't spend time with my kids. And so if you did every day like I do, you would know that it's an absurdity to suggest that the government should just put on some clubs and things and that they would go to them. They don't go out. They will spend 6 to 8 hours on social media every evening, you know, from the moment they leave school, and will be up until 1 a.m. On Snapchat. And they are only speaking to certain people who are in their little world, and they don't know what the world out there is like at all. And what I'm constantly saying to them is, you don't know the kinds of kids that you're competing against, you know, at private schools and so on. You don't ever meet these people. You've no idea their little culture. I mean, look, just a moment ago, one of my heads here came in, having downloaded, having got up one of their phones, one of their chat groups, the things that they're saying in there, what they're talking about. I mean, honestly, you'd be horrified. I mean, you'd be more than horrified. And this is normal in their worlds. And they would far prefer to be in that little world, being rude or whatever it is to each other, than going off and playing football. Like, the kids in the inner city don't go and play football. They don't go and do the kinds of things that you're imagining that they would go and do. And the reason they don't is because social media has such a pull. Not only that, but what I see myself on Twitter is that people with a big following on Twitter have a huge amount of pressure on them to speak to their base all of the time, because that's how they get more followers. So you've got to have somebody with huge integrity and huge kind of backbone to not do that. So because I'm somebody who would argue, generally speaking, I take a position against, say, the typical stuff that BLM would say, or I'm quite traditional in my approach to things. I lean to the right. I'm a social conservative. So I tend to attract lots of followers like those. But every now and again, I will tweet something that's quite left-leaning, that is pro-BLM, that is pro, I don't know, more progressive teaching or whatever it is. And whenever I do, I'll lose 100 followers easily. And so actually, it's not that there's zero. You at some point said that there's zero reason why you would do X, Y, and Z on social media. Actually, it's quite the opposite. You have every incentive to only push something that is the extreme of what your base thinks. And so, take somebody like Candace Owens, for instance. She becomes more and more extreme in the things that she says, because it garners more and more followers for her and makes her more powerful, as it were. And those of us who are far more trying to be balanced in what we say, and we sort of just shrug our shoulders and say, well, I don't care if it loses me followers. But you've got to be quite robust to do that. And when I think about the children here at school, none of them are robust like that. Everyone is just trying to get more and more friends and so on Snapchat. So they have to talk to their base, whoever that base is. And so the social media aspect prevents you from going out and meeting people, certainly prevents you from meeting anybody outside your group, and then makes you more extreme in your views, precisely because you've got to speak to those people. So I don't think we should, we should, I mean, I just think social media is a huge factor in all of the things that you're saying.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Yeah, and small plug for our culture wars work that's been out on this. Is the extremes are overrepresented in all of those types of things because it's built into the system to represent those extremes, and that is a problem, definitely. Raphael.
Yeah, I'll just be as quick as I can so I can get some more questions in. On the point about profitability, I think that's it's fantastically important because there is now quite a well-established kind of left social democratic macro argument which says in the in the longer term, for the society, it's much more expensive to have a fractured and unequal society because of the cost in terms of people get unhealthier, people who are afraid of crime don't go out, or people who don't know each other become more fearful. There's all sorts of ways in which you get a sort of social decay from an unequal and a fractured society, which is just expensive for the NHS, for the policing budget, for everything. That's a very persuasive argument to people who want to be persuaded by egalitarian arguments, and yet somehow, over the last basically 20 years or more in this country, no one really has succeeded in landing that very effectively politically, because we've had Conservative government for a long time, and even the New Labour government, which sort of was elected to do that, ended up doing a lot of that by stealth and didn't really change the frame in terms of articulating the, as it were, why you need so political macro state intervention to level things out a bit, because there's a wider gain even for the people who are better off. So that ultimately, to me, commercially, obviously, people will find ways to game fracturing profitably. It ends up being a political question of, can someone effectively articulate why that commercial impulse should be overridden by the state because everyone gains? And I wish it were more effective to articulate that. It turns out to be really, really hard.
Yeah. Thank you, Raph. So that's a great link actually into the other big group of questions, which I'll do as a little group again, and it'd be great to get thoughts on this and then try to get into one more round of a quick question at the end, because there is definitely the choice theme, and what this means for limiting choice has definitely caught people's attention, as you can imagine. So one set of questions around that is, what's the balance between limiting choice versus keeping common life institutions and shared practices organic and spontaneous, and the kind of happenstance elements of that? And then more directly, there's a question from someone about there's a possible autocratic element to the vision described. So we relied on choice to ensure a level of social justice that we have now. How do we ensure that the imposition of common space or common life is equitable, not captured by needs or entrenched interests when you get into mandation? And then a question about the political aspects of this. What would a conservative friendly way to portray the changes that John thinks we need, what would that look like? How would that go down with people? So if we can take that group as with quite succinct answers if we can, so that we can get on to just a final roundup.
Yeah, I mean, the politics in this is kind of intriguing in that I'm struck as I was talking to media about the book. The same argument is quite attractive, just in different language. This great country needs to be brought back together to be what it was before, and we can be united and make the best use of Brexit. We're far too divided, and it's worse for those who have the least power and left out, and they don't get the opportunities that they need. It's the same core thing. I don't think this is particularly left or right, but you do need to think a bit about language. You could say it's not left or right because it's unpopular with both. I mean, the basic idea of saying we should be mandated to do something shouldn't be popular. I mean, that is a fair starting point, in the same way that the person who first came out of income tax, didn't win a sort of, People's Choice Award. But I think those of us who care about liberty and care about being able to make good choices to live well, believe in income tax, because we think some money is needed to pay for the roads and security and health and education. And I actually think tax is a much more like authoritarian thing than the idea you might have to do spend some time with other people. I mean, the government of whatever colour takes money out of my pocket without me having any choice to spend on things I morally disapprove of, that it doesn't even need to hold a vote on. It just can do it by the executive's power. I mean, that is extraordinary, but I think it's fine. And I think actually part of the reason for opening the door is I think we could get quite fine with this if we had the right controls on board. And I talk in the book about how we might do some of those controls. I think I'll probably stop there, Bobby.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John. And Catherine or Raph? Yep.
Just on the conservative point, I think it's very interesting, going back to the remembering David Cameron trying to do the big society and why that didn't really take off. I mean, as I said, it said partly the fiscal situation that he'd got himself into wasn't sort of amenable to it, but also the Conservative Party at that time was still very, very attached to a sort of a late 20th century Thatcher-Reagan alliance era of small state right-wing liberalism in the economic sense, and had really sort of swept aside the sort of Burkean idea of the little platoons, which was always essentially about this sort of stuff. So there is a very, very strong available conservative tradition, and for as long as I've been writing about politics, there have been people in the Conservative Party, David Willett springs to mind, but who was a sort of precursor to what Cameron was trying to say, who have tried to make this connection. Theresa May did it when she became Prime Minister, talking about burning injustices. Boris Johnson, to the extent that he believes in anything, is capable of understanding and believing some of this stuff, but it just always rubs up against basically a kind of an ongoing, very solid core of fiscal conservatism that really is rooted in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and somehow gets to trump other brands of conservatism. I'll finish with the observation though of one thoughtful, is a researcher to a Labour peer who once said to me, compassionate conservatism is social democracy for slow learners. Which I thought was a bit harsh, but had a certain ring of truth to it.
Catherine.
Yeah, I would say that generally speaking, those of us who lean to the left are happier for government to interfere in our lives, and those of us who lean to the right don't want that to happen so much. And I think the removal of choice from people, I think people who lean to the right, me included, will wince at that because it doesn't sit well with us because of the smack of authoritarianism. And when you talk about taxes, I think lots of people on the right would say they want fewer taxes for that reason. But where you will get the right is on restriction of choice for children. So the left tend to be all about children should do whatever they like, give them lots of freedom. But when it comes to adulthood, that's where we restrict people's freedom. The right tend to be restrict the freedoms of children, and then when they get to be adults, give them lots more freedom. I lean to the right, so I do believe very much in the idea of restricting freedoms when it comes to children. And I think you might get what you want, John, if you were doing those sorts of things with children, you see, and they were to meet people and go across the lines and all of that, and connect when they're small. Then when they're older, you formed who they are, and then you can give them lots of choice, and they'll make the right choices. They'll be good people. So that's how I see it. I always see it from the perspective as a teacher. You're growing them up so that you can then let the little birdie go, and it can fly without you having to give all that scaffolding. And if you get it right when they're growing up, you see, and there's choices restricted, then you can let them go later. So that's my 2 pence from the point of view of the headmistress.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. So coming right to the end now, I mean, I did want to just give John a final word, and the sort of question that I've got that you can just give you any final reflections is obviously very relevant to the pandemic and post-pandemic recovery, your book about connections, and how you bring that together. So I just wanted, there's sort of questions about, is that going to increase the issue? But roll that into a more general thing of how you see the future, John. What comes next?
Yes, so there's a brilliant story that's told, which may be apocryphal, of at least the first bit of it's definitely not apocryphal. A book was written around the time of the end of the Second World War. So when Britain was completely convinced that we needed a nationalised health service and a welfare state, and some complete crazy man decided to write a book saying the last thing we need is a nationalised health service and a welfare state, and what we need is much more freedom from the government. And he wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom, and the man, of course, is Friedrich Hayek. And the book didn't really do anything. until a set of politicians were suddenly panicking and wondering what on earth they stood for and what on earth they were going to do in the complete mess that the 1970s seemed to have become. And the apocryphal element is that Thatcher, when she first sat around her cabinet table, pulled a book out of the handbag, put it down on the table and said, "This is our Bible." And the book, of course, in the story is The Road to Serfdom. Now I do take a rather long view of history, and that ideas that seem completely crazy at one point suddenly seem absolutely essential when a crisis hits. And so the aim of the book really is to try and hopefully be an interesting read, engage people, get everyone thinking, such that if in 10, 15, 20 years, we're actually saying, do you know what? Maybe we should do something about this. Maybe it's enough of not doing anything. Maybe we should actually just spend a bit of time getting our children to do something with other children, getting us as parents to spend time with other parents and do something about retirement. Here's a book that can lay out some answers. That's how I hope to see the future. And that's the aim of the book.
Brilliant. Great way to round up. Well, thank you for that. And thank you everyone for their questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get through more of them, but it was such a great discussion to get through those. And I know people are running off to have some lunch, or I had some, so we'll wrap it up there. So all I have to do is thank you all for coming. Thank everyone for attending. Really vital, I think, to find time for these big issues right now, when we can. Thank Policy Institute team, particularly George and Rebecca, for organising this. Thank you, of course, to our excellent panellists, Raphael and Catherine, brilliant contributions. And finally, to John for his brilliant book, which we can all go off now and buy online, or even better, buy at the weekend at your local bookstore. Thank you, John.